warmly welcome you to Carleton's 7th annual celebration for Carleton Economics alumni. In case you're not familiar, my name is Zach Sullivan, and along with David Mayer, I currently serve as co-president of the Carleton Economics Alumni Chapter. Part of Carleton's broader alumni network, the Economics Chapter is committed to bringing together graduates of Carleton's undergraduate, MA, and PhD programs to maintain connections through a range of social activities and professional networking opportunities. First founded in 2013 under the stewardship of former President Glenn Barber, the chapter has been responsible for seasonal book clubs, pub nights, and meet and greets, and serves as a source of information regarding events of interest for young economists in the Ottawa area. Of course, we would be remiss not to note the challenging circumstances under which this year's celebration arrives. Whether we are alumni grappling with the specter of prolonged distance work, or students and faculty forced to adjust their learning and teaching styles to the virtual classroom, we can all empathize with the temporary sacrifices we've had to make in recent months. On behalf of the chapter, we would like to express our well wishes to each and every one of you as we collectively navigate our way through this moment. At present, the chapter is adjusting its plans for the slate of events in the forthcoming year. As an organization, Carleton's alumni network operates under a philosophy of here for good. And in keeping with this tradition, we would like to reiterate our commitment to fostering a stronger alumni network. Present difficulties notwithstanding, it is our intention to continue working towards common goals with Carleton's undergraduate and graduate economic societies, respectively. To get involved and hear more about upcoming events, you can register for the alumni email list via the Carleton website, and you are equally welcome to join our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. This considered, without further ado, I'd like to open the microphone to Professor Patrick Coe of the Carleton Economics Department, to be followed shortly thereafter by our guest of honor, Mr. Glen Hodgson.
Okay, thank you, Zach. Thank you all very much for attending. We appreciate your time this evening. So my role here is just to give you guys a little bit of an update about what's happening in the department. I'm filling in for Hashmat Khan, who is our chair, who is indisposed this evening. So life in the department, I suspect, like for most of you, recently it's been dominated by COVID. When this hit back in March, there were a lot of challenges. We suddenly had to flip to teaching online. I think we all learned some new technology. Now everything is online now. I think with the summer to prepare, I think we have this going reasonably smoothly. And how has COVID affected us otherwise as well? It's actually been an opportunity for a number of my colleagues. If you're browsing the department website, you'll see that under our working paper series, 9 of my colleagues have published working papers on the COVID crisis and economic impacts of that. On October 7th and October 8th, we have a research event that's coming up, and a lot of that is not so much on COVID, but it's about how economics can inform policy. Other news in the department, we're very proud of one of our young new hires, Louis-Philippe Bellond, who has recently and is also one of our researchers who's very active in the area of COVID. Hashmat Khan, our chair, has recently won a university research award. And again, Hashmat is currently very active in research in the COVID sphere. Finally, in terms of sort of recent awards, Francis Woolley, who many of you will likely know, Francis has been a long time serving member of the department. Francis was recently awarded the CEA's Distinguished Service Award for sort of something that's a lifetime achievement award for service to the Canadian Economics Association. In terms of sort of where the department is, our student numbers, as you might expect with COVID, we're a little bit down on the undergraduate front. This year, our new intake is 76, down from 105. On the MA front, it's fairly stable. It's 27 this year versus 33 last year. Actually, our PhD numbers are up. It's 8 new students this year from 5 last year. Faculty turnover, we have a couple of new hires that we're very excited about. Thomas Russell has just joined us. He's a fresh PhD from the University of Toronto, teaches in econometrics. And on January 1st, Jevan Chernichuan is going to join us from the University of Alberta. He's coming in as a CRC chair in trade and the environment. So that's kind of my 3-minute spiel on what's happening in the department. I'm going to hand over now and put you in the very capable hands of David Mayer, who's going to move this along. Thank you.
So, hello everyone. I just noticed a Q&A, like a question pop up in the Q&A. Just for those who are popping in, you are muted at the moment. Following the Q&A session, you will be able to ask questions either via the mic or through the chat, the Q&A chat there. But we'll handle that a little later on. As Zach mentioned, I'm co-president of the Carleton Economics Alumni Chapter. This evening, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest of honor, Mr. Glen Hodgson. One of Canada's leading economists, Glen has 37 years of experience in global and Canadian macroeconomics, trade analysis, finance, fiscal policy, other big picture topics. Glen has worked at the Conference Board of Canada, where he was Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for 12 years, the International Monetary Fund, Export Development Canada, and the Canadian Department of Finance. He's currently a Fellow in Residence at the C.D. Howe Institute, Chief Economist with International Financial Consulting Limited, a member of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, and a Fellow with the Public Policy Forum. Glen has traveled the world and Canada as an economic policy analyst, financial negotiator, public speaker, and advisor to governments, businesses, and international organizations. Glen has also written 400 reports, briefings, articles, and is a source of regular commentary in the Globe and Mail. He has delivered many presentations to audiences of all types and sizes and done numerous media interviews via print, TV, radio, and social media. A graduate of McGill University and the University of Manitoba, he is also the co-author of 2 books, the most recent of which is Power Play: The Business Economics of Pro Sports. Without further ado, please join me in providing a warm and physically distanced welcome to Mr. Glen Hodgson.
Thanks very much, David. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you this evening. I didn't write the line about one of Canada's leading economists, but I'll take it. I think the measure of that is how often you go on BNN. Just waiting for the screen to pop up. There we are. By the way, I'm going to be on cross-country checkup on Sunday talking about whether we can afford to pay for COVID. So I guess economists never really retire. We just stop working full-time for one employer and then up working for lots of other people at the same time. I have about 25 minutes. And in the 25 minutes, I'm going to talk basically about the real world, application of economic thought, and what it means for you. So let's get at it. Oops, go back one. Okay, so here's what I want to cover tonight. I want to talk about 3 big challenges facing Canada, the rest of the world, and you as economists. First of all, the pandemic and recovery. I mean, I've been doing economics now professionally since 1981. This is truly an extraordinary event. We've never seen anything like this. And we're still, it's kind of like playing chess without knowing the rules or doing a puzzle without ever seeing the picture. We're trying to feel our way through and see where pieces fit. Making some progress, obviously could have done better if we'd actually seen the picture. But we'll work our way through this. Second, I want to talk about climate change and how to apply economics to climate change. And then I put up the idea of peak globalization, which is kind of a favorite theme of mine. Maybe I should put a question mark there. I don't have any slides on that, but maybe we can touch on that if you're interested in the question and answer. And then I thought I would talk about these challenges and what the opportunity is for you, both in terms of applying your core economic skills and knowledge, but also what other skills you're going to build over time to enhance your career opportunities and your life expectations. So to start with, here's what the global outlook looks like applying the shutdown. We were going to have a really ordinary year in 2020 where most of the world was going to grow more or less at potential. So in Japan, they're going to grow about 1%, Europe 1.5%, North America around 2%, and on and on. And then the pandemic hit in March, and you can see what the impact has been. So we're now looking at a contraction of as little as only 1.5% in emerging Asia to as much as 7.5% in Latin America. Overall, global GDP is going to fall about 5.5%. All the decline is behind us now. So the decline really happened between middle of March, when the world basically shut down, and then the reopening in middle of May. And I'll talk a bit about that in the Canadian context. Going forward, the world economy is going to be growing. Each region is going to be growing, but it's going to be very bumpy, sort of unstandard growth, with the risk, of course, of a second wave and having to sort of shut things down again. The US outlook, obviously, the United States is very important for Canada. We're deeply integrated within the North American economy. So I always like to put up a US slide as a touch point. And you can see the US economy is going to contract. The consensus is that it'll contract by about 5.2% this year. Again, the second quarter of this year was the worst. And then next year, growth is forecast is only around 3.5%, which is actually surprisingly small. It's actually lower than it is in Canada. One of the really striking things is how deep a fiscal hole the United States has gone into to try and work its way through this. We know how big the borrowing is going to be in Canada. In the United States, they're basically going to borrow 3.3 trillion US dollars, which is like borrowing 2 Canadas in terms of the fiscal impact. The BEA forecast for next year is they're only going to borrow slightly under $2 trillion. So huge impact in terms of fiscal deficits, huge addition to the US debt. And of course, Congress is still squabbling about a kind of a second round of programs to support the American population. In fact, there's a kind of a negative ripple effect going through financial markets right now, where they're concerned that the US Congress won't actually get its act together and have an adjustment program in place. On to Canada then, and this is going to be the centerpiece of my presentation. Canada was basically hit by 2 shocks back in February, March. We're all aware of the pandemic. You know, it's in the news like 24/7, every channel, every radio station you turn on, story of the pandemic. And the pandemic essentially forced the shutdown of all the consumer-facing businesses in the country. So that includes retail, hospitality, meaning restaurants and bars, hotels, airline, travel, and on and on. Manufacturing eventually had to shut down in Southern Ontario. Construction did not fully shut in every province, but ramped down. And then the reopening happened in mid-May. And we've actually had fairly sustained economic growth since then. The shutdown probably was more than 20% of GDP, probably something like a drop, like an elevator collapse drop in GDP of 25%, almost overnight. And then the rebuild is now happening, which is why the overall forecast is for a contraction of only 5.8% of GDP for Canada this year. And then growth returning in the second and third quarter into 2021. But of course, we also had the misfortune of being hit by the collapse in oil prices and global oil demand. So Alberta's been hit hard, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland as well. Oil prices have returned, but they're still stuck at around $40 a barrel for WTI US dollars. And global demand is now forecast to be down 8% this year. It's striking for me that both BP and Shell are now talking about peak oil being last year, that actually we won't get back to the same level of global demand as we recover, as we saw going into the shutdown. So these twin forces have really hit Canada very, very hard. So here's the picture in terms of the impact of the Canadian economy. You can see how deep the hole is this year. We are rebuilding. Striking, if you look at the StatScan data, how the second quarter was terrible for this year. We had a contraction of 11.7%. For some reason, the financial media all then take the subannualized number and talked about a collapse of GDP of 38%, which is ridiculous. 11% is already bad enough. But interesting, we actually had the shutdown was most severe in March and April. Growth reappeared in May of about 4.5%, and then the economy is actually growing at a fairly healthy pace right now at about 5.5% and 6%. But of course, the risk of a second wave is going to put a bit of a damper on growth. And then going forward, most forecasters are calling for strong growth in both 2021 and 2022, recognizing that we don't have a vaccine yet. those affected sectors are still going to be affected going forward for some time. So it'll probably be about this time next year that we start getting a herd effect of a vaccine. People will start rebuilding consumer confidence to do things like travel again, be prepared to sort of go out and engage with colleagues and friends. So I think that's probably the most likely scenario, is that we will have growth through the year, but it'll be end of the year next year before we really start to sort of ramp up the performance of the economy. At this point, I thought I would focus on fiscal and monetary policy. Now, we're sitting in Ottawa. Some of you have already entered careers within the federal government with advocates, people sort of working with the feds. And most of us watch fiscal and monetary policy fairly closely. And there was truly exceptional federal support put in place very quickly. I think kudos go to the colleagues in the federal government for how quickly they were able to figure out design programs like the STIR, actually design delivery platforms through CRA. So we're spending money now like crazy on the STIR, on wage subsidies, on rent subsidies, credit for small business, various other things. The STIR has come to an end, but we'll have substitute programs coming into place now. And Finance Canada told us during the economic update that we'll have a massive, massive federal fiscal deficit of $343 billion in the current fiscal year. Now, I worked in finance for 10 years, and the biggest deficit I can recall in my time there, and it goes back to kind of from the early 80s until the mid-1990s, was something like $35 billion. So imagine a deficit that's 10 times bigger than what I had experienced personally in my career. The federal debt ratio has increased by 50% overnight, up to nearly 50% of GDP. That's both due to the added spending, but also the contraction of the economy. And of course, we're in a complex federation in Canada. The provinces will also see deficits. And of course, we should anticipate that there'll be a big deficit again next year, because we won't have a solution to this until we have a vaccine. And that means more ongoing support, more deficits, and more debt. On the monetary policy side, the Bank of Canada is providing exceptional liquidity. You know, I think back to studying monetary theory at McGill as a grad student. And of course, there was no chapter in the textbook on either quantitative easing or on the kind of extraordinary liquidation of the economy that's going on right now. Short-term rates are slashed to zero. And the bank itself has said that it expects rates to stay basically where they are through 2022 into 2023. And at the same time, the Bank of Canada is now purchasing most of the public debt that's being issued. And that's quantitative easing. So we avoided QE during the global financial crisis, but now we're doing it just like everybody else, where the bank is buying the bonds to try and ensure that we have enough liquidity flowing through our economy. And that has allowed long-term interest rates to be cut. And it's also allowed the feds to refinance a lot of their old debt. The federal government's actually going to borrow over $700 billion this year through refinancing old debt and new borrowing. And the irony in all this is because interest rates are so low, the debt service charges within the federal budget are actually going to be lower this year than they were last year, which is what happens, I guess, when you finance debt at between 0.5% and 1% across the spectrum. And then rates are going to rise only slowly. I've actually put in, one of the things I learned in my time at the conference board is everybody cares about the price of money. And the best way to show that is through a chart on the yield curve. And I won't go through all the lines here, but the line at the top is 2019. That's what kind of a normal yield curve looks like in Canada, or at least we were heading towards a more normal yield curve, where very short rates were finally above 2%. The long bond yield, though, was still very low at only 3.5%. And then the bottom lines show you where we are today. The green line at the bottom shows you just how flat the yield curve is, where a 10-year government bond is only yielding 0.5%. Why people would actually lend money at that rate is beyond me. I guess there's certain rules within things like pension funds where they have to have a portion of their investment in fixed income assets. And then that rate, the curve is going to rise only slowly. So I looked at both the BMO and the RBC sites, and their economics teams are forecasting that the 30-year bond rate by the end of 2021 is only going to be sort of 1.6, 1.7%. So these are truly extraordinary times where the Bank of Canada is doing what its job is, was to ensure the sort of ongoing survival of our economy through reliquidification. One of the other oddities that I've discovered about this is that we're now saving money. Most of us who have an income are not able to spend all our money. And the more income you have, the harder it is to actually spend what you have. And therefore, the Canadian household debt ratio, which was rising very high, there was a real ongoing concern about household debt, has actually fallen below 160% of income just over the last 2 quarters. So some truly extraordinary things happening right now. In terms of business impacts, I was the chief economist, as David mentioned, at the Conference Board. A lot of my clients are in the private sector, and so I like to focus just for a second on business impacts. And clearly, elevated business closures, we're now starting to see the curve sort of bend in the wrong direction. And there will be impacts for business on their buyers, on their suppliers, and on their competitors. If you get through this, there may well be an opportunity to actually sort of consolidate and grow your market space. Obviously, people like hospitality and the hotels and airlines are having a really tough go. Secondly, there's been a real jump in digital sales. Digital sales basically have doubled overnight. There's been a drop of between 20 and 25% of in-store sales over the last 2 quarters. But digital sales have taken off, and I don't see us going back to kind of bricks and mortar retail economy. That will return in some respects, but I think every business now is going to be challenged to have kind of a digital sales channel, ensure that they can actually reach customers through the same technology we're using right now. Remote work has obviously been a big issue. I know very few federal employees, for example, are actually back on site. Most are finding ways to work from home. And evidence shows that productivity has actually gone up. People are saving time in terms of their own lives and their commute. They're not having to buy lunch out, but they're actually able to produce just as much working from home. And that's going to lead to a real rethink of the nature of the workplace going forward. Business always read about access to capital and credit. Now's the time to borrow. And I think a lot of smart businesses are finding a way to refinance their books. There was a disruption to supply chains, although I'm doing some work with the CD Howe Institute right now, and it's striking how quickly business is returning to kind of just in time inventory management and supply chain. So I don't, much as I would like to think businesses will rethink their supply chain and kind of anticipate disruption, ultimately business is driven by profitability. So I think the evidence is going to show that it's governments that will have to adapt to things like PPE, ensuring that pharmaceuticals are able to reach people. They deal with things that affect national security. Business is there to make money, and it's going to find ways to have the most efficient supply chain possible, maybe incorporating some of the adjustment going on vis-a-vis China. And then lastly, and this is maybe the point to make about sort of the plateauing of globalization. There has been clearly a decline in global trade and investment. There's been a closing of markets. I think there's a question about how we can reopen. And of course, the Trump factor is there in terms of his treaty with the Chinese. Brexit's also a concern. So I do think there's kind of an adding up of factors that should cause to kind of a rethink about how we're going to deal with globalization going forward. There's also the more and more evidence that we didn't do a great job of dealing with adjustment as we're going through our kind of free trade period in the 90s and 2000s. And thinking through adjustment programs as they affect trade, but also a sector like oil and gas is going to be really important, that we can convince people to go through the kind of pain we have right now, and that there'll be an opportunity for them at the other end of the tunnel. So theme number 2, in terms of sort of big picture things, is climate change and the economy. And I was a member of the Eco-Fiscal Commission, which was a group basically trying to use economic research to give advice to governments on the advantages of using price signals and not regulations as a way to change behavior. And our focus was really on climate change, on things like carbon pricing. So if you haven't looked at the eco-fiscal research, you have an interest. The commission actually shut down last year. It was basically replaced by a new think tank called the Institute for Climate Choices. But all of its research is available online if you're interested. Anyway, I'll also say that climate change is clearly an existential threat. It's going to be around for decades, if not for, it's certainly going to be around for the rest of my life, if not for the rest of yours. Canada is not on a pathway right now to meet its targets. Most countries are not. So we clearly have to do things to kind of up our game. Put in place policies, practices, investments that will speed up adaptation, help to reduce emissions. But as an economist, I always add the phrase without unduly limiting the impact on economic growth. And that's part of the rationale that economists often use for carbon pricing. It actually has the smallest impact on sort of job creation and GDP going forward. A big part of the climate change discussion is around energy. In fact, it's really the centerpiece. The sources of energy we use and how we use it. Energy's gone through many transformations over the last 150 years, and it's going to go through another one right now. And for me, the most likely scenario is we are now on a pathway towards a transition, and the pathway is going to be driven by a combination of market forces. So prices do matter. Price signals matter a lot in terms of consumer and business choice and investment decisions. Policy, of course, and then things like clean tech. So the effort that the federal government's putting on right now on clean technology is well placed as part of an overall strategy. The energy transition is now underway. I think a lot of you realize that. And it's taking place in a very competitive global marketplace where prices matter. So in North America, gas has already basically replaced coal for thermal power production. Coal prices, for example, in equity markets have fallen by around 80%. Gas, because of fracking in the United States, is around $3 a gigajoule right now, far cheaper. And part of the challenge going forward will be to find ways to attach carbon capture and storage to thermal gas to ensure that it can be used as a base load for electricity production, but also not putting any significant volume of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I'm really struck by the economics of renewables, how quickly they've become much cheaper. So solar cells and wind can both produce electricity at kind of half the price that we're paying in Ontario for kind of a nuclear, hydro, a bit of wind-based system. So 4, 5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And storage capacity is improving, but that's kind of the big missing piece for renewables. You may have noticed that California just had a little crisis where they had a blackout in the middle of the horrible forest fires that they were having. They've now shifted their energy production system where they have 1/3 of their production capacity based on renewables. And they simply don't have the means of storing it to ensure that there's kind of a steady base load over multiple days. So the balancing act to kind of get the engineering right and the technology right, recognizing the price advantage of renewables is going to be a big part of the energy transition. Nuclear, of course, we use in Ontario. It's a zero emission source, but it's also relatively expensive. And as Ontario taxpayers, we're going to pay a lot for the renewal of our nuclear facilities. And then, as I mentioned earlier, related to gas, carbon capture and storage technology will be a critical piece making gas competitive, and of course, ensuring that other parts of the economy continue to function, at least as a transition. And then, of course, as economists, we know what the options are when it comes to climate policy. You can put a price on carbon, which is by far the most efficient. The last eco-fiscal study that we did, we actually shot a model run by a firm called Navius, which is based in Vancouver, which does some of the best sort of carbon modeling in the economy, linking together economic activity and emissions. And carbon pricing was 2 or 3 tenths of a percent more efficient than regulations. If regulations can get us there. So the option to implement regulation is there, where you would have to cap emissions and then try and shift behavior. But it comes at an economic price. And so there's going to be a trade-off, and this is part of the big policy debate, the trade-off between sort of economic impacts, but also the willingness of voters to buy in. The revenue recycling, I think, is a really key piece for carbon pricing. I quite liked actually the federal backstop that was designed with the revenue recycling. Of course, we have a Supreme Court of Canada case going forward right now, whether the federal government has the jurisdiction to price carbon. As an economist, I have a hard time believing they don't. But of course, this is going to be decided by lawyers, not by economists. Policy option number 3 is subsidies and using the budget as a way to nudge change through incentives. And it's kind of ironic that often the red of center parties don't like carbon pricing, but they like providing incentives. But it comes at a budgetary cost. And the more subsidies you use, the more it actually costs you, as opposed to carbon tax, which actually provides a revenue source. And then lastly, investment in clean tech, investment in clean electricity production, distribution. Investment is going to be a very major part of the policy options. And I suspect that some of you will have questions, we'll have a bit of a discussion about climate policy. And then lastly, and I think I'm sort of more or less on track in terms of time, I expect most of you are fairly recent grads, like within the last 2 to 5 years. And I thought I would just share with you some sort of free advice from an economist who's at the other end of his career about your future and future management. I was having a good chat with with David and Zach about this in advance of the Zoom call. And so first of all, you made a really good investment. You made a very good decision, as I did when I was 19 or 20 years old, to take economics as a major or as your minor. And it gives you a solid foundation. You will find as you go through your career, a lot of people will say to you, they wish they had studied more economics along the way, because it gives you hard tools that you may not have enough social sciences, even in the physical sciences. There's ways to apply economics to almost everything that gives you a really strong foundation. So well done. That's a very good investment decision you've made. You've made a very good allocation of your scarce human capital. And within our training, we all have a kind of a mixture of knowledge and theory versus skills and tools. And I would include econometrics, math, econ, things like that, and the tools. And we learn more tools as we go along. And then lifelong learning. There is no perfect balance here. I mean, everybody will chart their own course based upon their interests, their areas of expertise, where you're strongest. I've worked with folks who had very little sort of mathematical or econometric training in various places, who had very good careers as economists. I led a team at the conference board where everybody was a macroeconometrician, where they were really good at the narrow work, but had a hard time with bigger policy issues outside, or often didn't write very well. So the optimal is trying to find the right balance that works best for you. Certainly, if you have the sort of hard economic skills and tools, even if you don't apply them through your career, you can always become either a critic or an advisor. As a PhD candidate, I had to study econometrics. I actually did fairly well at it, and then I never applied it through my entire career. But I always knew how to read an academic paper, or how to critique a piece of research, or give advice on what good research looked like. But there's also complementary knowledge, and I'm sure a lot of you are doing this. Never stop reading history, politics, math, technology, administration, governance. Governance is something that kind of fell upon me in my career. And then I ended up having exposure to sort of corporate governance at Finance Canada, at EDC, at the IMF, and at the conference board. So you never quite know what added skill set is going to benefit you as an economist. And of course, the last point, it never stops. I never studied game theory. It actually wasn't offered at either the Manitoba or McGill during my studies in the 1970s into the early 80s. But my son, who's a recent Carleton grad and now doing a graduate degree at Simon Fraser, and I've had a debate about applying game theory to climate change. So I've had to go back in the last 2 weeks and get up to speed in game theory. And so it never stops. I'm also building an expertise right now in green finance, because I do have experience in trade and development finance. And green is not that hard. You're adding in kind of the criteria that would make something green. And then you discover that there actually aren't that many people around who know a lot about green finance. It's become an area of a lot of activity for me. I'm writing a paper right now for C.D. Howe on the green bond market and whether the Fed should be issuing a green bond. So watch out, that paper will probably emerge before the end of the year. So bottom line, you made a great initial investment, but it never stops. You're going to keep investing in your economic skill set forever. I guess the big point I wanted to make is the other skills that you need to have real success, sometimes they're called soft skills. I call them complementary skills. And these are all difference makers. They may identify you as a candidate in an area where you're competing for a job, for example, in the public service, in the private sector, you're going through a competition, and you have to write something, and you're an okay writer, but not a brilliant writer. Or you have to be able to get in front of your branch or in front of your deputy minister and make a presentation. So now's the time to start building both writing skills and communication skills. I never thought I would end up as a chief economist doing 100 presentations a year when I was at the conference board. One of the great opportunities I had was at EDC, where I was taken out of kind of a corporate role and made the deputy chief economist. And I worked with Stephen Poloz, our former central bank governor, for 3 years. And Steve actually made me do presentations, and he made me do it without a net. He basically said, you're the expert. You're not going to have a presentation. You're not going to have notes. Just go out there and talk. You're the expert. And it almost killed me for the first 6 months. And then I learned how to do presentations without notes and how to tell a story. And so I would put writing and communications at the top of the list of the other skills that you need to develop to have a really effective career and to have alternatives, to have options going forward. Secondly, negotiating. Mostly, very few economists ever study negotiating. Actually, very few people ever study negotiating until in the workplace. And then you discover that in your personal relationship with your colleagues around the table, in interdepartmental meetings, dealing with stakeholders, dealing with other governments, you're negotiating all the time. There are formal negotiating courses that you could take. You can probably find something online to do. But I would strongly encourage people to think about negotiating as an added skill set, where you can take your good ideas, where you've done the research, you've written the paper, and you can actually begin to share those ideas and then win discussions or have an impact as you advance your ideas going forward. So the combination of communications and negotiations becomes really important. Third on the list for me is a kind of a combination of planning, being organized, and working on a team. Most of us will end up working in team settings. Being organized gives you a huge advantage over people who are not well organized. And planning doesn't have to be kind of a rigorous process, but you kind of think through the stages of any project you're working on. So again, important skill set to evolve. Innovation. Innovation in economic terms is just small changes that create value. For you personally, the ability to adapt and to innovate within a given space would clearly add a lot to your potential as an economist. I'm going to come back to resilience and adaptability, because I think we're all being tested right now with the coronavirus and the shutdown and recovery. It's how resilient. The fact that we're doing this online is an example of how Carleton and your alumni associations had to be resilient and find an alternative way of engaging. It's working so far. Financial management and then financial management, most of us don't learn how to read a balance sheet or an income statement in economics. But guess what? It's not that hard. I had to learn that at EDC. Once you learn it, you actually discover the myth of accounting. There's a lot of tricks that accountants know how to play. But actually, so doing financial planning, financial management is not that difficult. And then lastly, I put hard work on the list because at the end of the day, you may not be the smartest guy in the room, but if you're smart enough and the hardest working person in the room, you can have a lot of impact. Most of the people that I know who've had great success, better than mine, in their careers, simply outworked everybody else. And I won't name names, but people who ended up as CEOs, as major figures on bank boards, had some inspiration, but a lot of the reason they got there was through perspiration. So that combination of skill sets are all things that can complement your knowledge and your aptitude as an economist and make you an even more effective worker going forward. So last thoughts, I think the future is going to get more complicated, not less. I've talked about the pandemic response. Climate change is going to be the big issue. And I think it will last 3 decades, so it's never going away. There'll be other big issues. We're going to go through a demographic crunch. In fact, we're already facing it. There are other things will come along. I think your core education, you made a great initial investment. And now's the time to be building those complementary skills that will help you as you define your pathway. And bottom line, resilience is going to be a key going through these turbulent times, and will position you well for life's ups and downs, and probably add to your potential for success as an economist. And with that, I'm going to stop and look forward to questions, comments. You can play Stump the Economist if you want. I've actually done that with audiences before. It's lots of fun. And David, I think you're up.
I am. So thank you, Glenn, for a great presentation. Very insightful. We're going to be doing a bit of a Q&A session, and I can either relay the questions that you text in the chat, or I believe we might be able to actually have the mic put on somebody who wants to ask a question, and they can ask directly. So I guess I'll give it a quick second just to see if the Q&A bubble starts popping up. Cool. Yeah, so we have Madison Kunha, who is has 2 questions and is asking if to be unmuted.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes. Hi, Madison.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm actually not a graduate currently. I'm a student still, and I found it very interesting. I had two questions. One of them specifically relating to your graph on the household debt ratios dropping.
Yep.
So to me, that seems interesting. I work in personal lending. I work as with a mobile mortgage specialist at TD, and so we found that the ratio of people wanting to either break their mortgages to take advantage of dropping rates or just get new mortgages because house prices are dropping is quite large. So I was wondering if there was a breakdown specifically as to what type of household debt is actually dropping. Is it housing purchases, or is it things like high interest credit card debts, that kind of stuff?
Oh, so Madison, great question. You know, when I did my PhD oral a very long time ago, I was told to, if you don't know the answer, tell me what you do know. So I haven't seen the data broken down by types of debt. I have seen it broken down by kind of income levels. So I think your assumption is that people are paying down credit cards and sort of high interest debt, which is a good place to start. There's, of course, as you know, breakage fees on things like mortgages. So you have to do the kind of the calculus. Now, if your mortgage is at 4.5%, and what's that 5-year mortgage today? 2.25% for a creditworthy borrower, there may be a huge advantage in actually paying the breakage fee and getting your mortgage refinanced. In terms of income levels, the CERB actually gave income to lots of people. It actually improved the income position of many of the people that were CERB recipients. They had more stable income. They were able to actually deal with some debt issues. And then there's people like me at the end of their careers. I mean, I was a Fed for a number of years, so I have a federal pension. And our biggest spending was going to be on travel, and I can't travel. So suddenly it's crazy when I'm saving with a pension because you can only go to the LCBO so many times. But I think your underlying assumption is that people are addressing their high rate debt. That would be the rational thing to do. But I expect that you're seeing more of this than I am in terms of the kind of caseloads that's coming across your desk.
And then my second question was in relation to you mentioned that you were seeing firms reverting back to a just-in-time inventory, like supply chain model.
Yeah.
And so my question with regards to that is, do you find that there's a breakdown particular like by industry, or why do you think the rationale for reverting back to that is? Would it be something along the lines of like because if I was to think about it in general sense, the only thing that would make sense to me is if they're worried about, for example, having like stale inventory, they're worried about kind of a second wave issue, whereas they go back to full production, they build all this up, and then suddenly everything shuts down again and they can't get rid of it.
Yeah. So I've been part of a group at the CD Howe Institute since the pandemic broke out, looking at business impacts of the shutdown recovery. And we've done some sort of deep dive research looking at supply chains and have talked to people across a whole variety of sectors. So autos, other manufacturers, forestry, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, and on and on. And it's kind of a shared phenomenon. We actually can't find much of a difference amongst the sectors. You know, firms are ultimately driven by profitability. They've come up with global value chains or global supply chains as a way to operate because it cuts their input costs. And as long as they have confidence that the supply chain is going to be solid, they're going back to that model. No, I personally am a bit surprised at that. I would have thought that people would be thinking through resilience. And I do know companies, for example, that have alternative supply coming from different parts of the globe. For example, for a while, GE was actually doing hydro development in both North America, but also in Europe, and they were kind of competing against each other. And then the lowest cost would win the project. But the evidence right now is that we're kind of going back to where we were pre-COVID. And it's basically being put onto governments to deal with any national security issues, concerns about PPE, whatever. So business is kind of back to where they were, and it's purely driven by profitability, their ability to make money, because that's what ultimately drives business. If we add other factors in, for example, if we identify sectors, as we did with the PPE, so for a firm like 3M, for example, is now making face masks for the North American Canadian market, but that's based on a contract from the federal government. They changed their supply chain to deal with a particular sort of supply opportunity. But for the most part, we're having a really hard time finding a change in behavior. Hopefully there will be a publication coming out from CD Howe this fall that will talk a bit about that.
Well, thank you very much.
Just trying to see where we're at with some of the questions. So there is one that's in the question from an anonymous attendee. When looking into the future of the world economy, how can kind of peak globalization mitigate a economic collapse?
Okay, so I'll take that on. Well, first of all, I don't believe in sort of disaster scenarios. I think we just lived through the biggest disaster we're ever going to see in our lifetimes, where 20% of GDP disappeared overnight. We found a way through that. But so the peak globalization for me is a matter of looking at the factors that are affecting trade and investment right now. And I think maybe the biggest factor is that we didn't think through the adjustment programs required. I mean, Donald Trump is a phenomenon, basically due to the folks on the ground in the Rust Belt and other parts of the US economy who felt disadvantaged by international trade. Clearly, there's other things that he speaks to. But a big core of the Trump supporters were people who didn't see the benefits for themselves from globalization. And that may be one of the factors that's leading me to kind of think through whether globalization peaks, what the next phase is. I still think free trade is the right policy for Canada. So for example, I like the fact that we have been able to sign a deal with Asia. We have a free trade deal with the EU. We will eventually have one with the UK when they get their act together and actually sort of align with the Europeans. That's still the right policy for Canada. I also personally believe that open borders when it comes to capital flows both ways is in Canada's long-term interest. We're actually a net foreign investor out as opposed to receiver of capital. So we want to receive more foreign capital. For me, the big issue is around adjustment and ensuring that everybody benefits from the globalization story. And I don't think we've done as good a job as we had to when it came to dealing with the consequences of globalization. But I don't see economic collapse in prospect. I do think, part of the reason I talked about climate change as well as pandemic is those are clear threats we have to find a way to deal with. And if we don't manage climate change properly, so if you don't have the right policies in place to bring about the emissions adjustment and actually keep the temperature under 2 degrees, there will clearly be sort of very negative economic consequences to that. But collapse is a little bit too dramatic for me.
So I'm actually just going to jump in with a quick question of myself. Given everything that's going on with the kind of, I guess you could say, anti-globalization aspects of, say, Donald Trump, and even in Europe, you've kind of mentioned it as a bit of a plateau for globalization?
Yeah.
Do you foresee any sort of maybe even reversing back to a state that we were previously in, where there was a bit more, say, domestic production, or do you think it's just more of on the plateau? I ask mostly because you see similar kind of disenfranchised people out in other parts of Europe, and there's a significant rise in populism across the world.
I think the answer to your question, David, is going to play out quite differently in different regions. So in the US, for example, if Trump somehow manages to get reelected, there's going to be more of the same. The ongoing trade disputes with China, he clearly is trying to bring US production back from China. And he's not going to stop. There'll be ongoing sort of arbitrary interventions. There'll be threats. He tried to use NAFTA as a carrot to encourage production to come back to the United States. The Europeans seem to be fairly committed to the globalization pathway. But I think your point's spot on. Not all economies have done an equally good job of dealing with those who don't see themselves as benefiting. And that's where I think the focus really should be, ensuring we have the right adjustment programs in place for whether it's in terms of income support, getting people back to school, retraining, whatever, ensuring people all see an opportunity to kind of reinvent themselves on a going forward basis. Not every country is going to do that. For example, Russia is an energy economy. It's very much a closed system. It's not really playing in globalization. Think of something that's actually manufactured in Russia that's used around the world. It's very hard to find that. Whereas China is clearly bought into the model. China's challenge is going to be they're becoming less and less price competitive. Their challenge is to actually not get stuck in kind of the middle range, where they get per capita income to say $10,000 a head, and they can't find a way to break through. I'm not sure that what Xi is doing in terms of kind of re-centralization of power within the Communist Party is the breakthrough strategy. But China's clearly going to be the juggernaut going forward that'll determine what globalization looks like. And we didn't talk China-US, but the competition between the two for the next decade is going to be fascinating to watch. And Canada has to be very careful not to get caught between them. We clearly are an integrated player within North America. We may have to rethink our supply chains into China. That may be part of the rethinking of globalization. Ideally, China would become party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I'm not sure how they can find a pathway there. So I didn't necessarily answer your question directly, David, but I think the story plays out differently in different places. I would, if I was giving advice to government, I would put a lot of weight on ensuring you have the very best adjustment programs in place to ensure that the benefits of globalization are shared widely. There was a really interesting question asked early on. Did you pick it up, David?
Yeah, so I just realized that I had actually accidentally scrolled over it. I'm sorry, to Maitri. It says, what are your views on the interactions between data science and economics?
Oh my goodness. Well, so I don't have expertise in data science. I guess I would say that economists have been exceptionally good at turning to alternative sources of data and finding ways to use it in their analysis. David, from our earlier chat, that's part of what you're doing. You're actually sort of doing analytics within the trade and investment space or the development space. So I think the probing minds of economists are going to find ways to access data science and find ways to use it in their analysis. But I really don't have enough expertise as a data manager to talk about that in depth.
That's fair.
I can talk about the stock market, though.
Well, you know, the good thing. The next question is, so the stock market has done very well recently. Can we expect a downfall or a downturn this fall?
So the stock market should be guided by long-term profitability of firms. It's not. It's driven by either greed or fear. You kind of run from one side of the ship to the other side of the ship when your sentiment changes. We've had a really good run. Right now, the stock market's kind of rethinking what happens in the U.S. election. They don't like the market doesn't like uncertainty. What happened in that debacle of the debate on Monday created uncertainty in investors' minds. So we could reasonably expect there to be a lot of churn in the market this fall. The fact that I think we're on sort of a pathway to recovery, even though it's going to be bumpy, tells me that the underlying driver of stock value, which is profitability, is going to keep improving. And that says that maybe a year or two from now, the market will be up compared to what it is. Certainly, that's what one of my financial advisors tells me to get me to keep my mutual funds in place. But the market's not driven by logic. The market is driven by fear and greed. And economists should remember that. We can do the analysis, but you have to kind of build sentiment, either bull or bear sentiment, into your thinking.
That's fair.
And one day, too, if you do a good job managing money, you'll have some in the market and you get to play with it.
So the next question we've got is from Brian David W. Brian David W. How feasible is it to reduce Canadian trade with China by offsetting this with new trade elsewhere, Southeast Asia, Europe, and yeah.
Yeah, that should be part of the plan. I mean, Canada has actually done an exceptionally good job the last 5 years in negotiating free trade with other parts of the world. So we have the TPP, and we have the comprehensive deal with Europe. The whole point of that is to encourage, to give a pathway to Canadian business to get out there and diversify. So it's both feasible, and of course, we were heavily dependent on the United States for a long time. Our share of trade with the US actually peaked at 87% back in about 2002. Now it's down to about 70%. So over time, it is quite possible for Canada and Canadian businesses to diversify. And it's, look back at the first slide that I provided. By the way, if you guys want to share that with everybody, feel free. The fastest growing part of the world is Asia, is developing Asia. So if I was in Canadian business right now, I would certainly have a focus on trying to tackle markets like Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand, as well as Taiwan and Korea and India as a way. So we will probably not reduce our trade with China by a huge amount early on, but there's other growth opportunities in Asia we should be considering.
So I guess this is somewhat related to at least Canada's role in the world. What type of foreign capital does Canada need in globalization?
I think we need all types of capital, both equity investment, of course, access to bank financing. We need portfolio investment. We need foreign direct investment. But I think it should come with the condition, not in terms of the level, but in terms of the behavior of the investor, ensuring that people have sort of high standards, high environmental, social standards, also high transparency standards. So one of the few areas where I've ever written about putting barriers in place to foreign investment was towards Chinese firms, to ensure that they were actually going to bring the same behavior that we would expect from a firm in North America to their North American activities, that they weren't being used as a tool by the Chinese Communist Party going forward. So I think we should have fairly open borders when it comes to foreign investment. We've had an investment management regime in place for a long time now. It's actually worked fairly effectively. We do some adjustment along the way. I would actually like to open it up more, but I would certainly have kind of a fundamental principle about governance practices and the overall kind of behavioral standards of the companies.
It's kind of an opinion that's in line with Canada's kind of foreign policy objectives of rules-based trade and whatnot.
Yep.
So we've got a what seems to be final question. What do you think about the differences and dynamics of technological innovation, culture, or sorry, let me restart this. What do you think about the differences and dynamic of technological innovation culture between North America, Europe, and Asia?
So thank you, Boris, for the question. First of all, I'm not a doctor. I'm a PhD incomplete. I'm a doctoral candidate a long time ago. I never wrote my thesis. And then secondly, I actually don't know a lot about the sort of technological innovation cultural differences amongst regions. I mean, clearly, Asia is the rapid growth area, but there's still a huge capacity to kind of both invent and innovate in North America and in Europe. That would be a great research topic for somebody to take on, trying to identify the cultural differences within firms in those regions and see whether you can use it to explain, for example, the number of patents you're able to put in place. That's a very researchable topic.
And we have a couple, actually, two more questions coming in. I'm sure that we'll get a notification from someone soon to tell us to, hand it over. But for the time being, we'll keep going. So during election periods, how does the work of economists proceed? Is there consensus to follow current direction and await potential changes of policy? What would happen if past work becomes obsolete following an election cycle?
So that's a great question, Nelson. Election periods are actually one of the busiest periods within government. I can remember my time at Finance Canada. You always had to be prepared for a change of government or for a new minister. So basically, everybody in the department has to do briefing notes kind of on their big issues. And it goes into a massive briefing binder for the new minister or team of ministers that you're acquiring. It's actually a very busy time. And of course, ongoing original research is always there. There's always mandates that have to be delivered. So economists don't down tools during elections. They actually have to focus on getting the next government ready to govern. Nothing becomes obsolete. You can always build upon past policy, good and bad. So that becomes kind of one of the key inputs in your briefing on the preparing the briefing for the next government. And then the last question I love, can I pick that one up, David?
Sure, yeah, go by all means.
Africa is always left out because it is a colonial legacy. I think Olumafemi's question is very well put. I've actually, in my time at the IMF, I actually spent a lot of time reading about Africa, understanding that Africa is not a monolith. There's 53 or 54 different countries there. They all have different cultures. There's linguistic, cultural, religious, tribal differences, underlying economies differences. So I think that's a really good point. And maybe I should make a point of adding it to my summary slide. By the way, closing thought, Canada is always left out by The Economist magazine in its international comparisons. So that's the one thing that drives me crazy. I've been reading The Economist cover to cover forever. And it's maddening that they have Sweden and the Netherlands in their comparisons, but not Canada.
I have to write a letter to the editors.
As long as it's 50 and short, they'll publish it.
Yeah, fair. So,
I hate to abuse my power here as someone on the panel, but I actually have a question of my own, if you don't mind.
Fire away.
Okay, certainly. Well, it's actually a two-part question. So hopefully we can.
Okay, that's cheating, but at least you identified you're cheating in advance.
Fair enough. You've shared the most important skills and proficiencies young economists should seek to develop as they begin their career. However, how do you expect your recommendations to change as globalization makes all fields more competitive, say 5, 10, 15 years from now? Do you see your recommendations changing going forward?
No, I think that's a fairly basic set. I think what changes is your ability to assimilate knowledge from other areas. So whether you're good at negotiating, the soft skills I talked about, I think those are quite fundamental, in fact, to advance your career. What may change as things evolve is you need to draw on other fields. So I personally have always read history. I've always been kind of tuned into politics. I was struck by how much I've had to learn about governance. I've ended up doing consulting with financial institutions, and governance has become a really important issue. And the key, I think, is adaptability, your willingness to adapt and learn new things and kind of graft it onto your knowledge as an economist. So who knows, maybe the question on sort of data science becomes really critical. And all of us have to do a deep dive and understand artificial intelligence and its impact on economic analysis.
And the other question I had relates to something you referred to. You referred to at your time in graduate school that there was nothing in the books about the massive amount of quantitative easing that we've engaged in over the past 12 plus years. However, over the same period, the amount of inflation we've seen in developed countries has been, well, inflation's been anemic. How long do you expect this sort of counterintuitive state to persist, both in Canada and other advanced economies?
So remember, when I was a grad student, inflation was taking off. It was actually after the first oil shock in 1973 and during the second, which saw a take up inflation every place. And that's why, in my era, we all became obsessed with trying to find a way to put the inflation genie back in the bottle. Today, we're facing a very different issue, although interestingly, there are still hyperinflation countries. I mean, if you went to Venezuela or Zimbabwe, you would find that printing money doesn't work very well in an economy where all resources are employed. So I think the debate that's starting right now about a dual mandate for the Bank of Canada is kind of interesting. It's very hard for a central bank to have both a job creation and an inflation mandate, and getting the balance right is going to be really tricky. But the Fed's had that mandate forever, and they seem to have been able to keep their eye on the inflation ball, same as the Bank of Canada, but also be aware that they have to do something to ensure that there's job creation going on in the economy. The Bank of Canada has spoken the inflation line for a long time. They're always conscious of the impact on GDP growth and unemployment. So even though we haven't said it explicitly, I think they understood, the Bank of Canada understands. Tim Macklin's a very sharp guy. He and his colleagues understand that they have to have a well-functioning Canadian economy to ensure that they're seen as doing their job properly. But you're right, it's a very different era. We're trying to find a way to have adequate inflation to ensure that we're not kind of impeding the performance of the economy. It becomes the central question.
Fair enough. And with that, unfortunately, I see that we have run out of time for this evening's event. So I'd just like to extend my thanks to everyone, most especially you, Glenn, for taking the time to address us this evening. In addition, I'd like to express our thanks to Professor Coe for taking the time to represent the department. Moreover, on behalf of the Alumni chapter, I'd like to extend our gratitude to Professor Power for continuing to be an extremely helpful, accessible liaison, and not only for this event, but for countless others in the past as well. Further still, I'd like to extend our thanks to Rose Cressette from Alumni and Donor Relations, who took the time to coordinate logistics for this event, as well as Larry Munn from Carleton Instructional Meeting Services for his assistance on the technical side. And lastly, as our online attendees know, there will be a selection of a raffle/door prize, and it will be determined via random draw offline. Alumni Relations will arrange for the prizes to be sent to the winners. So this concludes the formal portion of the night's event. Thank you to all for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you at in-person events in the not too distant future. Stay safe, everyone.